Hello, I'm Jared Taylor with American Renaissance. Last week, I talked about the racial mix of serial killers and referred to this remarkable online report issued by scholars at Radford University and Florida Gulf Coast University. It's full of eye-opening data you won't find anywhere else. It's here that you learn, as I mentioned last week, that blacks are 8 times more likely than whites to be serial killers, and considerably more likely to kill only white victims than whites are to kill only black victims. Here are more interesting data. First, the number of known serial killers is way down from a peak in the 80s and 90s. In the 1980s, there was an average of 173 2 victims or more serial killers on the loose and 122 3 or more killers. By the 2010s, those numbers were down to 53 and 31. And as you can see, there were very few in the decades just before that. Why the sharp drop? The authors say there are fewer opportunities because no one hitchhikes and fewer people walk to school. Also, DNA evidence and surveillance cameras help. But strangely, as the number of serial killers has declined, the percentage of black serial killers has greatly increased. As you can see, at the beginning of the 20th century, the white percentage was much greater than the black percentage. But as the century went on, and the total number of serial killers rose and then declined, the percentage of blacks rose dramatically. I would guess it was because of civil rights, black power, and increased excuse-making for black failure. But I'm just guessing. Here are race differences in the primary motives for killing. For most motives, such as financial gain, enjoyment, or anger, blacks and whites aren't that much different. But for what the report calls gang criminal enterprises, that would include ghetto shootouts, blacks are nearly 6 times more likely than whites to be serial killers. A repeat black gang killer is therefore counted as a serial killer. However, there are not nearly enough black hitmen to explain why, for the last 30 years, more than half of all serial killers have been black. The numbers we saw earlier didn't even include organizational or gang-related serial killers. So, blacks are greatly overrepresented in what we think of as classic serial killers. Here are racial differences in killing methods. One really big difference is how much blacks, on the right, like to shoot people. Nearly 50% of the time, as opposed to 26% for whites. Blacks use guns more often for ordinary homicide, too. Also, about 11% of white serial killers poison their victims, while not even 0.5% of blacks do. There are race differences in average age at which serial killers start killing. Blacks start earliest, at an average age of 25.5. Then the average age of first kill seems to go up in 2-year increments, with Hispanics beginning their careers at 27.5, whites at 29.3, and Asians at 31.2. It's the usual sequence of black, Hispanic, white, Asian. The authors of this report got IQ scores for 323 serial killers. The average is 92.7 with a median of 85. Contrary to media portrayals, although there are a few very smart serial killers, they typically have normal to low IQs. Fully 58.9% of serial killers never finished high school. That's the red number in the no degree row. By contrast, only 9.1% of the U.S. population are dropouts. The line near the bottom shows that serial killers are only about 1/9 as likely as the rest of us to have a master's degree. But as you can see at the bottom line, they are 66% more likely to have a doctorate. So the brainy maniac killer is not pure Hollywood myth. 3.5% of serial killers have a PhD. IQ averages by race, the rightmost column, are about what you would expect. Blacks lowest at 79 and whites highest at 101.3. Asians come in under whites at 95.5, but this is from a sample of only 4. Generally, the smarter serial killers manage to kill more victims. Curiously, Killers who torture and mutilate victims have IQs a good 10 points higher than the ones who don't torture or mutilate. It does appear that white serial killers are more likely to go in for the gruesome stuff. With whites in blue and blacks in yellow, the first line of numbers says 11.7% of whites tortured their victims, more than twice the 5.4% of blacks. The next line, overkill, means riddling a corpse with bullets or beating it to mush, with blacks and whites about equal. For the next lines, though the numbers are small, whites are almost 3 times more likely to mutilate and 5 times more likely to have sex with the corpse. And finally, whites are more than twice as likely to drink blood. This could be partly explained by the relatively large number of black hitman serial killers. They're probably not cannibals. Or, if high IQ is associated with gruesome stuff, the 20-point black-white gap could explain it. This report got the sexual orientation of 2,638 serial killers and found that 5.3% were what it calls LGBT. The U.S. adult population is said to be 4 to 7% non-heterosexual, so 5.3% does not seem to be out of proportion. Unfortunately, the report does not try to calculate the percentage of LGBT serial killers who do gruesome things. Probably no one has comprehensive data, but this guy, Vernon Gibbirth, has some ideas. He is a retired lieutenant commander of the New York City Police Department with over 48 years of experience. He has a website called Practical Homicide Investigation, which covers homosexual serial murder. He writes that homosexual serial murders involve sadomasochistic torture, lust murders, thrill killings, and child killings, as well as robbery homicides, which are homosexually oriented. He notes that the famous homosexual killers Jeffrey Dahmer and John Wayne Gacy were especially barbaric, as were less well-known killers such as Robert Berdella and Larry Eiler. Carl Panzram, who was hanged in 1930, was another beast. He claimed to have killed 21 boys and men and to have forcibly raped at least 1,000. He said he had no remorse. And as he went to the gallows, he spat in the executioner's face. When asked for his last words, he said, "Hurry up, you Hoosier bastard. I could kill 12 men while you're screwing around." This report includes data about women, and some of it surprised me. For example, women used to be a far higher percentage of serial killers. This table says that before 1900, 49.5% were women. Admittedly, the data are old. The percentage of women keeps declining over the years to 7.9% in the 2010s. And women have different motives for killing. As you can see, men, the top row in yellow, kill for money 28.3% of the time, but women, in blue, kill for money nearly 70% of the time. This includes the classic black widow, who discreetly knocks off rich husbands one after another. According to this report, this used to be common, but is harder to get away with today. The next line down shows that 27.7% of male serial killers do it for sexual thrills, but only 3.7% of women. They are probably accomplices of men. And then, at the bottom, we see that women are only 1/12 as likely as men to be gang killers. No surprise. If you take the time to look at this table, you will see that women rack up body counts as effectively as men do, and are actually more likely than men to have more than 5 victims. As for killing method, only 2.4% of the men used poison, but 54.5% of the women did. Again, the classic black widow. But this table includes historical data. My guess is that women use poison less often than they used to, but I suspect they are still less likely than men to strangle victims or beat them to death. As you can see from this table, women occasionally torture, mutilate, and drink blood, but not as often as men. The report has no data on how many of these women were accomplices or acted on their own. A typical serial killer couple might be Gerald and Charlene Gallego of California, who killed at least 11 young women after kidnapping them and keeping them as sex slaves. Charlene was clearly the junior partner. Another sex difference is that women are more likely than men to kill infants and children. And as you can see from the top line here, 43.5% of men in yellow kill strangers, whereas only 11.6% of women in blue do that. By contrast, in the next highlighted row, you can see that only 11.2% of male serial killers murdered family or lovers, whereas a huge 57.1% of female serial killers did. In the third highlighted line, you can see there is something to the idea of the diabolical nurse who poisons her patients. Nearly 18% of female serial killers murder people in their care, while the percentage for men is only 2.6. A recent example is Lucy Letby, a British neonatal nurse who was convicted last year of killing 7 newborn babies and trying to kill 6 more. She never confessed or gave a motive, but the prosecution suggested she enjoyed playing God and also had a crush on a married male doctor who would be called in when an infant in her care started having dangerous symptoms. Americans don't pay much attention to foreign serial killers, but they're all over. Wikipedia has a list of serial killers by number of victims, with the 33 most successful. There are only 2 Americans on the list, and not one in the top 10. The world champions are a real mix, but there are 8 Russians and 6 Latin Americans. The top killer? Luis Garavito, a Colombian pedophile and necrophile who raped, tortured, and killed at least 200 young boys in the 80s and 90s. He died in jail last year, age 66. We think of Japanese as law-abiding and conformist, but Wikipedia has a page of 25 Japanese serial killers who got the death penalty. Some were cannibals and necrophiliacs. The method of execution in Japan is hanging. Here's a different wrinkle on serial killing. New terror tactic. ISIS orders Western jihadis to become serial killers to spread fear. ISIS recommended random stabbing because the jihadi doesn't have to own a gun and knife attacks are hard to prevent. Killings of this kind are more like gang hits than our usual idea of serial killings. But in 2012, this French-Algerian al-Qaeda fanatic, Mohamed Merah, killed 7 Frenchmen over the course of a week before police shot him. Well, I think that's enough about serial killers. In the last 10 minutes, we have shed gallons of blood. If there is a message, it's that male and female killers are obviously different, and that there are also important race differences. Non-hetero serial killers probably have their own weird patterns, and eventually we may have enough transsexuals to draw conclusions about them. But enough of that from me. It's the serious scholars who are the authorities, and these men should get a lot more publicity for their careful, valuable research. Thanks for watching. The censors hate my videos, so if you like this one, please send the link to a lot of people. I also invite you to visit amren.com, amren.com. You find videos, podcasts, discussions, many things I think will interest you. But again, thank you so much for watching.